Our topic today is talent management reimagined, and we know that nonprofits are generally under-resourced in a number of different areas. So how do we find creative and innovative ways to attract and retain the best talent? And how do we optimize their capacity to perform and retain that talent over a longer period of time? So the term talent management is one that we certainly heard a lot of more in the last few years, more than the traditional human resources function. So we're going to define our perception of what that is, and then how do we look at it with regard to our clients and our organizations themselves. So let me introduce Gregory, who's my colleague in this discussion today, and Gregory is with Aspen Leadership Group. So Gregory, you want to tell us a little bit about you and Aspen?
You bet. Thanks, Richard. And greetings, everyone. Good to have you online with us this morning, or at least it's morning here in the Pacific time zone in Phoenix, Arizona, where I am located today. It's good to have everyone joining us. And a little bit about myself. My background is in higher ed and research institute, fundraising, communications, board management, and marketing. And I have been with Aspen Leadership Group for a couple of years now. The firm is probably best known for its executive search work, primarily in the advancement space, but we're also very active in consulting and in DE&I training, mostly with boards and C-suite executives across the full spectrum of the nonprofit sector, not just higher education, but everything from arts and culture, social services, advocacy groups, et cetera. We are the #1 firm in the country in placement of advancement professionals. There are larger firms, but we actually place more since we specialize in that space. We're a virtual company. We're all over the nation and have been in the marketplace for about 8 years now. So we're excited to be part of this collaboration with Richard and his wonderful team at Phoenix Philanthropy Group. And I think we'll just get ourselves started.
And just a little bit about Phoenix Philanthropy for those who don't know. We're a firm, a fundraising consulting and nonprofit management consulting firm. We're based in Arizona and in California, but we work nationally and internationally. Most of our clients are in the higher education space, but we're involved in arts and culture, health and human services, social justice, and the environment. And I'm speaking today from a perspective of a fundraising consultant and nonprofit management consultant. I'm also a small business owner who has dealt with a number of these issues, not only with our clients, but with our firms. And then what did I take away from when I was a vice president of advancement at the universities that I served? So that's the perspective that I bring. Gregory brings the perspective of Aspen Leadership Group, which is a terrific company that we partner with with many of our clients. And so we're happy to be working with Gregory today. So let's start it off, Gregory, with you defining from your perspective and Aspen Leadership Group's perspective about how, talent management. How do you define it and how does it differ from the traditional HR function?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. The term, as you mentioned earlier, has been around for quite some time now, the term of talent management. And I think it reflects a growing movement that began a bit back that has tried to think about the investment that organizations make in developing their personnel and finding ways to retain them, and seeing that actually as a strategic management objective above and beyond the more traditional HR functions that would be more associated with things like payroll, benefits, management of personnel conflicts, et cetera. Talent management really is helping people develop career laddering, ideally within an organization, sometimes by moving through different organizations, and finding ways to invest in that talent that has a return back on the organization that's helped make that investment. So it's probably more of a partnership, at least that's how we at Aspen Leadership Group view it, a partnership between the advancement professionals in an organization and the organization itself to really help the organization move forward at the same time that the individual's career path is also moving forward. And I think it's a constantly evolving understanding, and certainly some organizations are more effective at managing that than others, and there are individuals that are more effective at taking advantage of it than others. And we enjoy partnering with them on both sides of the equation and often provide consulting services as a part of the search work that we do to help that connection, that sense of mutual partnership, be more overt, more deliberate, and hopefully more beneficial to both sides of that coin.
So we're going to do a short survey so we know some of the topics that you all may want to talk about. So Amy, if you would put that up. So what's your biggest talent management issue for your organization? Is it hiring new talent, growing the skill sets of that new talent, achieving cultural alignment, retaining talent, providing a meaningful professional development pathway, and knowing when you have the wrong person on the bus? So have at it, and then we'll have that help direct us in our conversation.
All right, I think we're ready.
Okay, so what's the answer?
The results are flying in.
Oh, knowing when you have the wrong person on the bus. That is.
Well, that tied for second, though, not the number one. Tied for second.
So if you have heard the expression with regard to slow to hire, quick to fire, that would be something that we can talk about. So a meaningful professional development pathway is the leading issue. So that's what we'll get into today. And we're a small group, so feel free to either put your questions in the chat to Amy and she'll bring them to our attention, or just raise your hand and we'll call on you and we'll have discussion and question along the way. We'll just keep it really casual. So at Aspen Leadership Group, Gregory, as you look at talent management, what are some of the key issues and trends that you're seeing right now that you think are certainly have been impacted by COVID? What's going to stay? What's changing a little bit as we are coming out of that?
Yeah, that's really a great question. And I don't know anybody that's in our space that has not been profoundly affected by the pandemic. It completely rewrote the rules in almost every way that we can imagine, not just obviously in our personal lives and the terrible losses that have occurred in many families, but in the way that organizations think about the relationship that they have with their employees. And as we all were forced to last spring, move to a virtual footing for an awful lot of, in particular, white collar level positions. And what we've seen has actually evolved over time. So the issues that we were all dealing with last summer, let's say, seem to have sorted themselves out in terms of just how do you stay connected with your employees? How do you work on issues of maintaining morale and a sense of connectivity across the teams? How there are communication channels between upper management, middle management, and frontline staff in the development field in particular. But those issues, as I say, seem to have somewhat found a balance amongst themselves. And the issues that are facing organizations now and the employees that are with those organizations are related to the reconstitution of teams back into physical locations. And that is an issue that right now we see many organizations trying to figure out what is the best way to do that. How can it be done safely, of course, paramount and number one on every organization and employee's mind. But secondly, what roles maybe don't have to come back into the physical location in the way that we saw them before? Or is it some kind of hybrid arrangement where roles that were partly in the field and partly in the office maybe now are fully in the field or fully in the office, depending on the circumstances? And a lot of the clients that I'm talking with right now, and I'm involved currently with probably about 17 clients at the moment who are working with everything from frontline development officers all the way up to the chief development officer, and in some cases, the executive director or the CEO. They're trying to figure out how can they classify those positions. How do they reshape the parameters of the actual job description and the expectations around how to manage that new job description regarding whether the employees are on-site or off-site, the obvious spillover effects of that in terms of space planning, the need for actual physical infrastructure, being able to upgrade external technologies so that people can actually get into a permanent footing where they're working partly remote rather than some of the patchwork solutions that have been out there for the last year or so. Many organizations are wrestling with these issues, and like so many of the complicated issues that are in life, there is no simple solution. There is no one size fits all. Every organization has to wrestle with it based on their own objectives, their own culture, the kind of relationships they have with employees. I would say that one trend that has absolutely taken shape in the last 6 months in particular is the expectation, especially with frontline development officers, of the expectation, if not the desire, to remain remote or to have a very limited office presence. And that has immediate implications, not just the management issues, but let's say you are a firm that's trying to find a frontline person, and you're recruiting for that person, whether you're using a firm or doing it through your own resources, and you find an excellent candidate. Let's say you're located in Chicago and the candidate's in Atlanta, and the Atlanta candidate is really the person you want, but they're not willing to relocate to Chicago. So it's had a really big impact on the budget for relocation, budgeting, as well as the kind of benefits that you might put into the recruitment package. But the other management question that comes with that is how effectively can that person work remotely, and what are the duties of that person's scope of work? In other words, if that's a qualification officer and they don't have existing relationships, they're going out there and building new ones from scratch, is remote the way that they can operate that way versus maybe a principal gift officer that's working with established relationships and doesn't want to have that relocation, wants to stay where they are? Is that a more easy kind of set of objectives to be able to facilitate remotely than that qualifications officer? And as I say, since there is no simple solution to any of these things, each organization is trying to come up with its own response to that. And I will tell you, some organizations are much more flexible in their mindset about how they try to address that issue. And they are, frankly, the organizations that are having much greater success in landing the talent that they want. And there are organizations that are not willing to consider that remote working arrangement and have been or slower to adopt it, or slower to adopt the decision-making process about how to make that work. And as a result, they're having very serious problems building candidate pools or attracting the level of talent that they want. I know a colleague of mine that was working with one client that normally would have had a very large pool of candidates. This is for a major gifts director. And normally we'd see maybe 25 or 30 highly qualified people that we would talk to. We have 7 in this case with that client. And my colleague has told me that there were 20 some odd individuals who refused to engage the client because the client was not willing to consider remote work, even on a part-time basis. So there are consequences to the footing that an organization takes in terms of its flexibility, and everybody is kind of trying to find their own path here. But there is certainly a built expectation now from the experience that we've all had in the last year. There are a lot of folks who want to work remotely and at least on a part-time basis, and organizations are going to need to adapt to that, not only for recruitment, but certainly for retention. And if you've got frontline officers or even middle managers who have gotten accustomed to that pattern of work, and now they are resisting calls to come back to the office, it calls the question, no pun intended, for the organization to decide whether they're willing to risk the departure of that talent because of maybe some inflexibility in the thinking of management about how to accommodate that. I know that was a really long answer, but I am from the Northeast and Irish, and we like to talk, so my apologies.
It's very thorough, thank you. I want to just talk about some issues and trends we're seeing with our clients, and I'll put them into 3 buckets. Some of the key things that we saw, before COVID and are continuing, those that are maybe COVID or DEAI specific, and then I think some of the implications that we're going to see post-COVID as we move out of that. One of the key issues that has been around for quite a long time, and there was an interesting survey of chairman of the board, CEOs, and chief development officers of organizations, and the perception of each one by the other. And the answer to that question was about, and the perceptions were about, a lack of aligned expectations and clear understanding of the role of each of those people. So the chairman of the board often misunderstood exactly what the chief development officer was supposed to be doing and the CEO is supposed to be doing, and particularly between the CEO and the chief development officer, back and forth. And so the expectations were there for performance, but not effectively communicated. So those expectations were not mutually agreed upon. There was not a agreed upon plan to guide that activity and those strategies. Metrics might have been a little bit vague. And again, so expectations weren't clearly aligned. So I think it's really important, as you are looking at talent management and retaining people and growing people, is that you have clear expectations about what is strong performance, and you have the plans and the reporting mechanisms to back it up. A couple of other things, of course, outsourcing and contract workers is an issue that many organizations are pursuing. There is an ability to, and certainly a need to, build and retain talent for the longer term. We know in the fundraising profession that it takes generally 40 to 44 months to build a relationship a major gift relationship to fruition. And development officers tend to turn over every 20 to 24 months. So think about how that impacts your fundraising, short-term and long-term. And then also, a key point that we're going to touch on a number of times today is the alignment of mission and vision and values, and how does that fit vis-a-vis experience? When do you hire based on a strong resume and skill set? And when do you hire based on the alignment of values with the people who you're looking at bringing on board? And I don't think it's either or, it's both. But we certainly have changed our perspective of the role of aligned values and increased that as a key component in the hiring decision making. So, of course, during COVID, Gregory talked about most of these key points, and that is the issue of remote working. But I think also there was an understanding that work-life balance is a little bit different when you're remote working. On one hand, you don't have the time that you're spending on the freeway. You're not sitting in unproductive meetings. I mean, the productivity and the focus of Zoom meetings, I think, is quite superior oftentimes to then being in person. But it also means that you can be working at midnight. You can be working at 4 a.m. whenever you want to. And so some people view that as a real advantage, and some organizations view that as a real advantage, because you know that the productivity would keep moving forward. But sometimes it meant that people couldn't kind of withdraw or take a step back from work, and they were in essence constantly in the working mode. And I think that that's a consideration that we have to think about going forward, as people will continue to work remotely. So, what are the protocols for shutting down? Do you not answer emails before 7 a.m. or after 7 p.m.? How do you handle that so that those expectations are aligned, and people know that when there needs to be a response, when we need to have an answer to a key question, that's going to happen. But also when time is that for a person to have with their family and friends, and they don't expect to be at work. I said also that the definition of trust in the workplace has changed a lot. And we all know that most of us had a situation before COVID that people were quite hesitant about remote working. A lot of, quote unquote bosses were feeling that they're not going to get the productivity out of their workforce if they're remote learning. And we've in fact clearly learned that that's not the case. But the issue of trust and what clearly defines performance and deliverables is something that is changed a little bit. I would also say, specifically with my fundraiser hat on, in terms of the ability to raise money from a remote environment, and not being in person, there are many challenges aligned with that we all know. But there are also great opportunities, and the vast majority of our clients did not see a decline in their fundraising at all during COVID, and they were able to advance relationships, including major gift relationships, even up to a $60 million gift that was closed during this period of time. So that type of virtual interaction was certainly better with those people with whom relationships were well established. So those loyal donors or those prospects who were well qualified and engaged. It meant that the new prospects in terms of discovery might have been a bit more of a challenge. And it should not have impacted fundraising, but I do think it's going to potentially impact our pipeline for the future and what key prospects we're going to have queued up for the next couple of years. And then finally, a last point would be defining the parameters for future work. Gregory talked a bit about, how many organizations are going to allow remote working, and what is that mix going to look like going forward. I think it's important for employers and employees to start right now defining how they want to work going forward and have a proactive conversation about it. Because there are certain pitfalls that you could fall back into that were pre-COVID work models that frankly have been not that productive or not that accommodating to people. So think about it. I mean, we're thinking about it as a firm. I used to spend 50-60% of my time on the road. We would be in front of our clients at least once a month for 2 to 4 days. We haven't skipped a beat with our clients during this period of time. We're not in front of them as much. In fact, I've only visited 2 clients in the last 13 months, 12, 13 months. And everything is moving forward kind of as planned and like clockwork. So I think we're going to be defining the parameters and make some suggestions and recommendations to our clients. And I think that employees with their employers might want to look at that as well. So we both had long answers on that one. So any questions or issues at this point before we jump into the next point?
Yeah, we'd love to hear from anybody here in the group. I know you're all dealing with these issues directly yourselves, and it'd be interesting to hear some questions that might be coming to your desk, your attention as you try to wrestle with these issues. And we can we'll look for those in the chat if that's the easiest way for folks to throw those at us.
We do have one question that came in.
Great, thanks.
So attracting talent for campaign and administrative leadership at our small university is hampered because of our low salary scale. We have talent at the mid-level profession, but there is no plan to develop and retain personnel. How can the case be made to upper management for the need to create such a plan?
You want to start, Gregory?
Sure. That's always a vexing situation, and I think everybody is sensitive to salary escalation and what that the effects of that on nonprofit organizations, and certainly in higher ed as well, as was just asked. What I would say is that there's a tool that's very commonly used in a lot of other areas for looking at fundraising success, and using the idea of benchmarking. And it doesn't make the resources appear to make your case using benchmarking, but we do find that our clients that might be in a similar situation where they believe their salaries may not be as competitive, or even not sure how competitive their salaries might be, will be to do some informal benchmarking using a consulting firm or associates that you may have, past colleagues around the sector, to get an idea, so that the presentation of the data allows the decision makers within the organization to have a clearer vision about what's necessary in order to have the success that they claim that they want to have. And I think anyone that's come through the ranks of a frontline fundraiser knows that there is a pretty healthy return on investment for the dollars that are invested in advancement. And that includes the administrative positions. That's part of the infrastructure. That's part of the apparatus that lets an organization experience success. Advancement is a revenue-driven part of the nonprofit world. And if the case can be made by using benchmarking to show what that gap may or may not be, and to make the case for putting additional funds into the FTE, it can also help validate that maybe you're not as far apart as you think you are. You may actually be more competitive than your initial gut is, because I think our inclination, and I hear this from candidates a lot, is that everybody thinks they're behind the curve in terms of where their salary is. And that is often actually not the case. So the benchmarking can also validate that maybe and give you some confidence that to be in the marketplace with the positions that you have at the salary ranges that you're offering, and know that that actually isn't the obstruction or the obstacle that you might think it is. And the benchmarking can help validate that for you. Richard, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'd add a couple things. With regard to low compensation versus your competing organizations, I think then look beyond compensation and what are the advantages and incentives of working within an organization, and be true about them and evaluate them and maybe measure the impact that they have. And again, those might be non-financial bonus, or they may be non-financial incentives like flexible work hours or a closer commute, or whatever it may be. So know those, list them, value them. While the institution may have low compensation, probably the development people, frankly, are paid a little bit more than others. So look at acquiring talent from within the organization, but not within development. So don't always look at other development officers, but look at people who, like, if and this was a higher education institution, look at people who might be in admissions or recruitment or executive education or some programs like that. That in essence, they have an external facing responsibility. They're in quote unquote sales, and then help to train them in the development arena. And in many cases, it's going to be a step up in compensation for them as they move from those other areas. Within development, we can have bonus and incentives. Now, that sometimes presents a real problem if the entire institution doesn't have it. But again, kind of an external facing sales position, there are often bonuses and incentives. And beyond the non-financial incentives, I would also talk about the issue of culture and impact. And to, in essence, sell the culture of your department, if it is a good, effective, and nurturing culture. And then the impact that you have in the organization and how critical your department or unit may be, not only in terms of the university overall, the students, but then the community. And that impact, I think, is one way to sell it as well.
Yeah, can I elaborate on something there, Richard? Because back to the question, but pulling out something that you just mentioned about that crossover internally, there's a lot of benefits to that, not just in filling empty positions in the development office, but there's just a lot of more emotional reward when people get a chance to see other parts of the operation or to see the mission of the organization through a different set of eyes by being in a different role. I literally just yesterday was talking with a candidate for a position, and I asked the candidate who had been the most influential mentor in that person's career. And they pointed to the time when this individual, the candidate, had been in the events team, and somebody over on the development team had recognized the natural abilities of this individual doing the events work. And as Richard just pointed out, that sort of externally facing role, and we've all seen our events folks in those situations, and they saw that talent. And so they provided a bridge for that person to move their career over into the fundraising function. And that person now is a chief development officer. So this obviously happened some years ago, but it was about that internal scan of who the talent were inside the organization and giving somebody a chance to move over. And I'd add one last thing to that, and that is that don't undersell the mission of your organization as a powerful tool to attract people. I am continually surprised by folks who are willing to move at a lateral level on their salary because they are so attracted to the mission of the organization that they're talking to. People are highly motivated by the impact of the organizations that we're in. And that's probably even more so in the nonprofit sector than anything else. So people will come based on that internal culture, but also the impact of the vision that the organization has for changing something in society.
All right, so let's talk about values and culture specifically. So Gregory, how can a focus in on values and culture improve your talent search and acquisition and retention? And how does it impact productivity and quality of work life?
It's an interesting question, Richard, and it plays a little bit to what we were just talking about in being able to articulate the kind of culture you have inside the organization, to recognize things about your organization that are unique, the way you've built the team, the backgrounds of the people that might be on that team, any kind of successes that you've had in being able to let somebody career ladder within the organization. But I am constantly hearing from candidates that one of the things that has attracted them to a position that they've heard about was the ability to know what the values were of the organization, that they were actually a public statement, that the organization was staking itself in the public light to a certain way of doing things, and that those values have a magnetic quality in and of themselves to bring people to those values. So being willing to articulate those values externally, not just internally, might be something that could be considered for some organizations. And we do see a lot of resonance with that among candidates. And I would hasten to add in that same breath, particularly around the issue of inclusion. There is certainly heightened awareness in this last year. The anniversary of the murder of George Floyd has really re-engaged this conversation nationally. And we find that clients often talk in terms of diversity, but candidates usually talk in terms of inclusion. And so the ability to talk about your environment as inclusive in an authentic way, you can't fake that and just put it out there as a statement. It needs to be a real, living, breathing thing inside the organization. So the work starts at home first. Are you inclusive? What are you doing to be inclusive? Have you examined your exclusivity? What are you doing to tackle those issues? When candidates find an organization that is genuinely moving the organization to embrace those sets of values, it really resonates with them. And then from a retention standpoint, when I talk with clients who are trying to maintain the excellent forces that they have built over time, they have found ways to engage their employees in those processes rather than just saying, well, that's something that's a function over in the HR team. That's their deal. No. The work has to be genuine and organic. And the way that that can happen is to bring everybody into the process. And that includes your development officers, your middle managers, and your executive team, and giving people some sense of responsibility and accountability to addressing those issues. And it really helps to build something that's authentic across the entire enterprise, no matter what your size is. So I would say, to sort of sum that up, that making sure that inclusion is a high priority for your organization, and many of us are trying to make up for lost ground, and that's perfectly understandable, but making up that lost ground in an authentic way is real, and you can engage people, and that engagement internally can actually be a retention tool.
I would add that we as a firm and in working with our clients have learned the real tangible value of hiring people based on values and mission alignment first, talent and experience second. We still want the very best talent. Our clients want the very best talent. They want people who have raised big money, who have run good size operations, who have a proven skill set that is going to help them to be successful in the workplace. But if there isn't alignment of values, that's going to impact the work ethic. That's going to impact your DEAI ability and statements. It's going to impact communication. It changes from making it a safe and inclusive and learning organization versus one that I would say is more kind of tactical and getting the job done. And I think it becomes a really competitive advantage when the entire employee group, from top to bottom, inside out, share and are aligned around values and mission and impact, because then you exude that in absolutely everything you do. Justin is in the environmental arena. We work with a number of clients in that arena, and some zoos. And it's always been interesting for me to see how they hire their people. We work with the Charles Darwin Foundation, and if you did not have specific conservation work, not just your talent base, but if you didn't live and breathe, conservation and protection, and were not willing to go out in the field with the scientists, you weren't going to work there, because you had to live and breathe this every single day. And I've seen that more in environmental organizations or animal welfare organizations, but I think that it really adheres to a lot of different organizations along the way. So, and also we have seen some of our clients really kind of urge us to look beyond the traditional models of hiring, and with great success. Now, we're not an executive search firm, that's Gregory's job, but when we help our clients look for talent, we had a client a number of years ago who had been hiring and going through development directors right and left. And they said, why am I hiring the same thing over and over again? It's not successful, it's not working, let's try something different. So instead, we had a candidate who was much older, who was not from the region, but had this knowledge of the art form and this sense of communication and style of communication, which was so compelling. But maybe, didn't know her way around a database, didn't really like to talk about segmentation and other things in development, but that alignment of her culture and her personality was perfect. And she was the most effective development director they had. So, Gregory, one thing that you talked about when we did this before is unknown exclusive language. And talk about that a little bit. Because we want to talk about how to be inclusive and how to be encouraging and make it a safe place for our employees. But there are a lot of things that we just don't know that we're doing that is going to be rather exclusionary.
Yeah, there's so much, so much unconscious action that we are all exuding all the time. And by virtue of definition, it takes somebody else to point those out to us because they are unconscious. So that immediately places us into these situations of delicate conversations and challenging conversations and sometimes fearful conversations where people are unsure of their safety, unsure of their understanding, afraid to maybe admit that they don't have the understanding that they want now and that they want to have. And it's a vulnerable place to be. And we see this happening a lot when a client is trying to put together what, at least at our firm, we call a position prospectus, basically the vehicle that tries to describe the nature of the role, not just in the core competencies, but maybe a little bit about the flavor of the culture of the organization. And there's a natural or historic tendency to be very specific in job descriptions when job descriptions are being written. And again, that's kind of back to that HR function where you do need to delineate certain kinds of skill sets, but that mindset has spilled over in a lot of the recruiting that goes on and in a lot of how people expect their careers to advance. And that expectation of checking off a list of very specific past experiences is effectively a way to perpetuate the same kind of often poor results in having an inclusive search and a diverse group of individuals to look at to fill a position. Let me give you a case in point. How many times have you seen a position posting for, let's say, a principal gift officer, where the organization wants 10 years of experience, managing $1 million proposals and gifts coming from let's say in the university space, an AAU university, and who is willing to travel globally to do the work. You on face value might say, well, of course, those are normal things to have for a request. But think about who fills each of those kinds of requirements. It's the same people that have always filled them. The same people that have always filled them. And so therein lies the rub. So could those requirements, and by the rub, I mean finding a largely white pool of candidates, typically male, sometimes female, but those are the folks that are in the profession now to a large degree. And so it perpetuates continuing that pattern of not having the diversity that a lot of our clients are trying to achieve. So can those same sets of skills be cast in a different way so that it doesn't look so specific, but still gets the same kind of skills? So instead of 10 years of $1 million proposals for a university, could we talk about that in terms of demonstrated experience working with high net worth individuals? Well, that's a different cast, isn't it? But it might still bring forward not just the folks that we've traditionally seen, but people who may have done that work in unconventional ways that aren't typically seen, and now see themselves potentially in that position prospectus, thinking, oh, I've done stuff like that. There's quite a bit of data that there are certain sectors that will rule themselves out of candidate pools if the checklist is too extensive and too specific. Women are inclined to be willing to rule themselves out if they're unable to check each of those boxes, the data says, as well as candidates of color. They don't believe that the environment will be inclusive because it's so specific with these very particular kinds of backgrounds. So we end up setting ourselves up for this challenge where people rule themselves out before we've even had a conversation. So can the language be flipped? Can the core skills be identified and characterized differently in a way that lets more people see themselves having the potential to fulfill that role? And can the organization recognize those skills and let go of the stereotypical kinds of backgrounds to see the kinds of folks who can cross over and come and bring the kind of rich diversity and have the inclusive environment that lets the organization and those individuals flourish?
So Gregory, the issue that was most impacting everybody on the call was the issue of retaining and growing good talent. So what are some of the key things that you recommend to your clients in retaining top performers and growing them and keeping them within the organization?
It's an interesting question, Richard, because I think the answer that comes to everybody's mind right off the bat is some kind of incentive base, having a bonus of some sort or being able to escalate the salary. And I think, honestly, that's just sort of the boring, safe answer that the surveys that we follow indicate that particular offering drops down to 4th, 5th, or 6th in the level of priorities of what people actually want. And I think we just have a default because this is America. We're kind of a consumer-driven mindset. It's about that ability to have financial reward and be successful. And certainly that's one measurement that's out there, and I'm not going to argue against that. But we find that a lot of candidates are looking for different kinds of things, and a lot of our clients, existing staff, are looking for different things. Things like, how are people being recognized? What are the ways that they can be validated internally that shows that their impact has a bearing on the organization's direction or the short-term results that are trying to be measured? Can there be ways to build flexibility into the description? We talked early on today about the role of having flexibility in remote work. Can that be codified in a way that it's actually something that's in the job description so that the candidate or the existing employee can feel that that's something they can bet on or bank on, that it's been acknowledged and accepted by the employer, and not just sort of some tacit understanding between a manager and somebody else. And hopefully that agreement stays intact. So can it be codified and actually placed into the job description? Can there be ways for people to be given special projects inside an organization And I've seen that happen over and over again, where an organization will have a project, and we see a lot of this in the DE&I work that's underway, where you engage employees to cultivate their leadership ability and to acknowledge the fact that they've really shown their commitment to the organization and the ways that they're going to express their value to the organization, giving them those special projects, letting them be visible as leaders. And I know I see some former colleagues and friends on here at like Peter Lamott at UConn, where they do that, Micromedia at ASU, where they do things like that. Those are some of the ways that we can build retention into the existing ecosystem without necessarily resorting just to the financial equation. Pardon my
I would
throat
add a
here.
couple of things. This can be risky, but we're working with our clients, some of our clients, to put together multi-year contracts for key performing and senior level executives, because the issue of turnover is such a concern. So we're looking at 3-year contracts with increased compensation, but increased metrics along the way. So that's one opportunity. Another is going back to something I talked about before, and the misalignment sometimes of expectations between the CEO and the chief development officer and others. Just making sure that the strategic plans, the operating plans, the performance metrics, and the quantifiable and qualifiable metrics and expectations are well articulated. And then I would say another one is, as you're looking at a professional development plan for somebody, do it in conjunction with the person who you are developing. Make sure that it is not only advantageous for the organization, but it's advantageous for the person. And remember, not everybody has the same path or the same capability of professional development. And this happens a lot in fundraising. In fundraising, sometimes the only way to grow your career is to get into management. And let me tell you, I know a lot of really good fundraisers who are really bad managers. They're much better as kind of independent, on the road, relationship managers, not managers of people and offices and processes and systems. So don't try to create a professional development model that is right for everybody. Customize it for the people and the talent that you really want to keep. Let's jump to a couple of questions. We've got about 12 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions that came up. Dominic had a question about what is a good salary to compensation ratio for fundraisers, or no, compensation to productivity ratio. So how much should somebody be raising, depending on what their compensation might be? I think what we look at is that it should be a minimum of a 4 to 5 to 1 return. So in essence, the salary cost is only 20 to 25% tops of what somebody is raising. So a 4 to 5% return. But I think you really have to look at that as, number one, over how long has that person been there. Somebody who's brand new, just picking up relationships, is not going to be as productive as somebody who's been there for 5 years. Number two, that 4 to 1, 5 to 1, in my mind, is more appropriate for smaller organizations and small nonprofits. It may change in larger institutions. And three, you got to look at what the portfolio is. Are their portfolio $1,000 donors, $10,000 donors, planned giving prospects, major gift donors? That is going to impact it as well. But I do know that you don't necessarily want to have the same ROI expectations for all the staff, particularly if the quality of their portfolios are different. So somebody who's raising money for a business school versus a arts and culture program, you would expect that the return would be much higher in a business school or an engineering school. So think about that in terms of kind of the comparative analysis that you do for those positions. So Gregory, what do you look at for that issue.
Well, I really think you nailed it there, Richard, in terms of that kind of perspective and the context about each of the roles within the organization and what the size of the opportunity is out there relative to the prospect portfolio. I often bristle a little bit on the question about that kind of return on investment, not because the question itself is wrong, but a lot of times I find in organizations that that question can go to the extreme where the understanding by upper management about the best ways to evaluate the effectiveness of the development program is simply a function of those ratios. And I think we've all watched over the last decade or so the pretty robust public debate that's been out there about, you know, the cost benefit analysis and the cost ratio for evaluating nonprofits and all the different scorings that are out there now with different online tools like Charity Navigator. And I've always felt that that's kind of a short-term view of our profession, because relationships have other aspects to them that are not simply about the immediate ask and the immediate close of a proposal. There are other things that are going on in that dynamic that also have value to the organization and need to be brought into the calculation either quantitatively or qualitatively. And it creates a great opportunity for a dialogue to elevate the understanding at the management level about the value of the development program. So yes, we want to be efficient. I understand that. And I think that that's a great thing to have in mind, you know, in Dominic's question. But I also want to flag it to say that is the question in any of our organizations also a sign of a lack of understanding of the nuances and the sophistication that comes in a really good development program? And is there an opportunity to open that dialogue up to get that deeper understanding with the managers or the executive team?
And we always recommend at least 3 different types of performance measurement, not just financial. One is financial. So how much are they raising? What's cash, what's not cash? How's it coming in over a period of time? Number 2 is the quality of their portfolio and the activity of their portfolio. And then 3 is just activity in terms of moves, asks, and closes, and what their fulfillment rate or success rate is. One of the key things in fundraising we all know is that you don't have timing over the decision-making process, or you do not control the decision-making process of your donor and the timing with which they may want to make a gift. So they can make a gift on June 30th or July 1, December 31st, or January 1, and it could completely screw up your goals and your performance for that fiscal or calendar year.
And does.
But if you have the activity, if you're moving on your portfolios, if you've done all of the right steps and that gift just hasn't landed at the right time, then you should be awarded and rewarded for that. Then there's another question about when we talked about living the mission, and this was from Pam. And Pam, it's great to know that you're here with us. Long time no see. In terms of living the mission, and that sometimes that is a challenge because living the mission can mean that volunteers and others, in essence, that boundary between personal and professional could get a little gray. And that's something that I think is a real issue in our profession. Because if we are living the mission and if we're all so passionate about the organization, we want to continue to give, do, accomplish. And sometimes that means it's 24/7, or if it's social as well as work, and that can be a problem. I heard the phrase called that what we are doing in nonprofit management and particularly fundraising is it's a lifestyle business. And, I think that's true for a lot of us. We love what we are doing. We are passionate about the impact that we are having. And, our jobs really aren't 9-to-5 jobs, and that's okay. Now, we also know that going to all the parties is not as glamorous as people think it is. But I think that recognizing it's a lifestyle business is important. But I do feel it's important to have boundaries between staff and volunteer leaders, particularly your governing boards and others. Because at the end of the day, the relationship should be between that donor or that volunteer and the organization overall. You are a conduit of building that relationship, but it's not ultimately a personal relationship that is going to last a long period of time. It's ultimately about the relationship between, again, that person and the institution and the mission of the institution. Gregory, anything to add to that?
Well, it is a complicated question in a lot of ways, and many of the questions that are coming forward are. That's why we're asking them and having a conversation with ourselves about them. You know, I have to admit, Richard, that my own thinking about that separation between the professional and personal boundaries between donors and development officers at whatever level, my thinking has evolved over time. I used to have a very black and white mindset about that there really should be a hard line between the two. And certainly there's need for some boundaries, and you can see things like, you know, the code of ethics with AFP that talk about things like that. But I also believe that relationships are really what a lot of this boils down to. And one of my own pet peeves about the turnover that I've seen in our profession, where people don't stay in their organizations very long, is a reflection of them not building lasting relationships with the donors that they work with, that they begin moving from position to position and trying to re-engage folks who were already engaged with the organization, but now you're the new face and the new person or the new conduit that they manage that relationship with. And I wonder if maybe a healthier way to not only get more longevity in the individual roles that we play, maybe a healthier way is that we do have a deeper relationship with the donors that does start feeling a little more personal. Maybe we're able to stay longer in that organization because we feel a greater sense of obligation, not just to the employer and how they're compensating us, but also to the donor, and knowing that you've built a long-term relationship there, and that relationship has a value to you as a fundraiser. And so I have a much grayer perspective on it now than I once did, and believe that there are some very powerful relationships that do get built between development officers and the donors, and that sometimes those can be leveraged to great impact with the organization. And I look back in my own career with somebody that I had a donor relationship with for almost 10 years. And that donor went from a gift that was $5,000 a year to the annual fund, and eventually became a $50 million cash gift to the institution through multiple presidential changes. And what ended up being the only continuity in that relationship was yours truly. I wasn't special, but I was the one that made sure that that relationship didn't fall through the cracks. So there's something to be said about that longevity in the relationship. And so I respect the need for some boundaries, and you don't want it to be taken over in your personal life. But I think we can go a little deeper with some people, and that might help also solve the turnover issue to some degree.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left. You can have one of the two with your closing words of wisdom.
Well, they're just closing words. You can decide how wise they are. I will point out in the chat, though, for anybody that wants to follow up with Richard or I individually on any of these topics or others, our contact information is in the chat, both our organization's websites and our personal emails and our mobile numbers, and we'd be happy to hear from you. I would just say that the world that we're in is evolved in an incredibly unpredictable way over this last year. And if there's any value, going back to our value conversation, that is really going to be important, is it's just that adaptability and flexibility and the willingness to be transparent about the way we're having our dialogues. I think those core values will get us through an awful lot, and did get us through an awful lot in this last year. And there's no substitute for open communication, whether it's between the gift officer and the donor, the gift officer and the manager, the CDO and the CEO and the board with their other volunteers. The willingness to just explain the dynamics that are being faced and to be open about those, and to recognize none of us are perfect, is really going to be the key to future success. Richard, your thoughts?
My closing words of somewhat wisdom would be, number one, culture and value may overrule skill set. You can oftentimes train a skill set when you cannot train values and cultural alignment. And an organization that is looking at the criticality of values, of mission, of impact needs to really be prepared to walk the walk. And that is, again, with regard to culture or mission, it has to do with inclusivity, it has to do with trust. And those things need to be infused throughout the entire organization to be successful. And I think that's it. Here's our contact information. Thanks for participating. Good to see a lot of you.